So if you're used to the familiar setup that I do in my tutorials, just make sure to take a look down in the description where I'll have a timestamp where we actually start the material. And if you're new, here's how we're going to start our material. We want to come up to File. We want to click on New Substance. We want to come down to our Physically Based, and we just want to give our graph a recognizable name. In this case, I've done Wood Floor. And we want to set our size mode to relative to parent so that we're able to change the size, the width and the height on the fly. If you didn't do that, that's okay. We can double click in our graph here and we can come over to Output Size and we'll just click on this little icon here. And if you had set it to absolute, it will be this little red square, and we can just make sure to click relative to parent, so that now we're able to change our parent size on the fly. So the way that I like to set up my materials when I start creating them is I add a base material node, and I use this guy to visualize all of our elements in 3D. So you can see if we double click, we just get a nice gray texture, and we come down and we get a lot of different parameters. The first thing I want to do is make sure that we set this to dielectric, because I want to just have a non-metal material that's kind of like a grayish plastic. And then I want to come down to our user-defined maps here, and I want to add both our normal input and a height input, because we're going to just start by creating our geometry for the material, and we only really need the normal and the height to do that. We don't want to worry about, color data, roughness data, metallic data, anything like that. We just want to worry about things that affect how the light is going to bounce off of our surface here. So now I'm just going to drag in a normal node, and I'm going to plug that guy in. And you see that nothing is going to show up because right now we actually have these output nodes viewing in 3D, so we don't have any information. Now the last thing I want to do to set up is I want to make sure that we are able to view our height maps, because right now if I plug in a grayscale map here, both to our normal and our height, and then I right click on our base material to view this guy in 3D, you can see that we get our normal map showing up, but we don't get any height information. So in order to have that information show up, we just need to come up to our materials, default, and edit. And then over here in our height, we just want to scale it up. And you can see now that it's showing our height map information and just syncing in the data into our object here, our mesh. I'm going to go ahead and delete this guy. And now we are set up to start working on our wood floor material. And now the first thing that I do when I create any new material is I want to go and start creating the base geometry. And with the base geometry of a wood floor is going to be the planks that we're going to get tiling across our material. So the way that I go and start creating that geometry is I actually use a brick generator. And you can see that right now it's giving us some nice brick patterns, but we can manipulate this node to give us some pretty nice looking wood floors. So I'm going to plug this into our normal, and I'm going to plug this into our height. And now we're going to get these very sharp bricks protruding out of our mesh here. So I'm going to bring our brick generator back so we have some room to work. And so now I'm going to double click on this guy and just make sure that we get all of our parameters to take a look at here. So the first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to come up to where we have our brick X and our brick Y value. And so I'm going to bring our X all the way down to 1, so it's just tiling once across our material. And if I just hover in our 2D texture area and hit spacebar, you can see that our material is tiling across seamlessly. And I also want to scale it up a lot more on the y-axis just to get a little bit thinner boards. So I'm going to bring our 8 up to about a 10. And so we're going to get some very thin planks of wood. So as we make our way down our parameters, you can also see that on our 2D texture and our 3D texture here, we have these very harsh bevels. And we don't want our planks to be beveled like this. We want them to be pretty flush with the other boards. So we can also decrease the bevel on both the Y and the X axis. And I decrease these down to about 0.03. So that they're very, very sharp. You can see just a little bit of gradient between the boards here. And we take a look. It's almost like they're going straight down. And we'll do the same thing for the Y. Coming up to see the Y values here. 0.03. And now you can see that we're getting some very fine boards. And if we take a look here and we just throw in another environment by just clicking and dropping that guy in, you can see that we get some very, very fine looking and smooth looking planks of wood. And already our geometry is starting to take shape. Now I find that this these boards, or this board pattern, is a little bit too generic or too straight for what I'm trying to accomplish. I want to have a little bit of warping in the geometry of our planks. And so I'm going to add over top of our brick generator here just a slope blur grayscale node. And we're going to use this guy to basically affect the edges and the indents of our boards, and just going to give us a little bit of variety in terms of chipping. So over top of this, I'm going to add a Gaussian noise. You can really use any noise that you want. I use Gaussian noise purely because we have this scale guy down here, and I just like the way that it looks over a Perlin noise, or instead of a Perlin noise. So that's why I use Gaussian. So I'm going to take this guy here, and I'm going to plug him into the slope input of our slope blur. And you can see that it gives us these really wacky results. And that's because we have pretty low samples. And we also have too high of an intensity. So I'm going to bring this guy right down. And you can see now we're starting to see the boards a little bit smoother. But we're getting these really, really harsh results, very cutting results. And you can see that it cuts into our geometry a little too much. So the one thing that I'm going to do is I'm going to change our mode, and I'm going to change it down to min. And you can see that each different mode gives us a little bit of a different result, with blur trying to blur both of the min and the max results together. So I'm going to switch it to min because I think it gives us one of the better results, but I think that it's a little bit too noisy still. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to take our Gaussian noise here, and I'm just going to bump down the scale. And essentially what we're doing is we're just making the scale of the Gaussian noise a little bit larger. And you can see how that affects our geometry here, as it's just increasing the gradients that we have to work with. So playing around with it, I think I'm going to stick with a scale of 14, but I'm also going to add one more element over top of our Gaussian noise just to randomize it a little bit further. And so I'm going to take our Gaussian noise, and over top I'm going to add a directional warp. And with this directional warp here, I'm going to take our Gaussian noise and I'm just going to plug it into the intensity as well. And you can see it's not going to do too much. And if we play around with the warp angle, you can see that it is kind of warping around. But we have such a low intensity that it's not going to do too much. If I bump it up to something like 40, you can see that we get a little bit of a more intense or sharper image. And I like the look that it gives us where we just get a little bit of dip into our mesh. And it gives us some nice tearaways from our geometry, or our planks. So now that we've got our edgeware, I just want to come back to our brick generator because we have a lot more information that we're going to be able to play with down here. And so if I position this just so that we can get a nicer look of our material, we're going to be able to see just kind of what these different parameters are. And so with our gap X and Y, you can see that we just increase the gap of both the X and Y coordinates there so that we get some more isolated geometry. But because our planks are relatively close together, we want to keep this a little bit down. And I'm going to put it to something like 0.01 for the Y. And I'm probably going to bring it down to 0 for the X, just so that they're a little bit more equal. So now that I've got our material where you can see a little bit nicer, I'm going to scroll down and I'm just going to look at some of the other parameters. And you can see that with our gap here, just like in the brick tutorial, you can change the gap between each of the planks or the geometries here on both the X and the Y coordinates. Now with wooden planks, we want to keep that relatively small, and for the sake of this material, 0 works just fine because we don't want to have huge gaps between our geometry. We can also play around with the height values of our planks in the actual node itself. And you can see that if I bring the height down, or the minimum down, it actually decreases the height value of the planks on the mesh. And so I'm going to bring our minimum down to 0.95 just so that we have a little bit of a variance to work from. And you're not going to notice it too much, but there's going to be a little bit of breakup in the monotony of the material. I also want to play around with the variation, as it's just going to randomize where these values fit and where they're placed so that we get a little bit more randomness. And so something like that looks pretty good. And I'm also going to come back into our environment and I'm just going to change it to something like this guy here. And as we scroll down a little bit more, you can see that we can also play with the slope factor, which basically just gradiates our planks and just gives us this little bit of mishmashed look to it. And again, if we play around with both the X and the Y values, we're going to get very random looking results. But you don't want to overdo it because you're going to get something that's a little bit too aggressive for at least the look that I'm going for. If you want a little bit of chaos in your material, then by all means go for it. But it's not going to work with what I want to do. So I'm going to really decrease the slope. I'm going to bring up the variation just subtly. Just so that you can barely see really any of the results, but they're there. And as we continue down our chain, it's going to be more and more visible as to what these effects are actually doing. So now we've actually completed all of the height information that I want to create for this material. So the next thing we're going to do is we're just going to start by adding all of the normal detail. Most of this material's information and detail comes from the normal map. And so the next thing that I want to do is start by creating the wood grain effect that we're just going to use to slap over top of our entire material. So in order to start that, I'm going to come up here and I'm going to add a directional noise 1. And you can see this already gives us a bit of a look of like wood and, you know, like wood grain and fiber. And I'm going to use a directional warp. And I'm also going to use another Gaussian noise. And we're going to use this guy to basically warp our wood grain so that it's not just straight through and pretty uniform. So I'm going to bump it up to 100 first, just to see what it looks like. And you can see that it's starting to take on the actual form of the Gaussian noise. And so I'm going to bump that intensity down just a little bit. And I also want to turn this to 90 degrees. And so now we get to see what the effects are doing. By bumping this guy down, we're going to get some more interesting wood grain, but I also want to bump down the scale of our Gaussian. And so now we want to add this over top of our normal map. And so what we're going to do is just going to take our normal back just a little bit. I'm going to add another normal map, making sure to click away so we don't add it on top. And I'm going to connect this guy right in. And now you can see that we're going to convert all of this information into another normal map. And the way that we're going to blend both of these normal maps is by creating a normal combine node. And what I'm going to do is just plug this guy into our normal 2, because it's going to be the information that we're going to plug over top of our base normal map. And so we can just think of this normal combine kind of like any blend node, where you take the foreground or the top layer in the top node, and you take the background or the bottom layer in the bottom node. And so once we combine these, you can see that we start to blend together the normal maps. And I just want to come down to our technique here, and we'll go detail oriented. And so now when I plug this guy into our normal map, you can see that our wood grain starts to show up. However, it looks a little too busy. And so what I'm going to do is I'm going to come back to our normal map over here, and I'm going to bring the intensity down to something like 0.2. And you can see we're just getting very subtle wood grain. And I just want to play around with the intensity again. Just to get a little bit nicer of a wood grain going. And again, just playing around with the warp intensity. And now this really falls on more of a personal preference. And I played around with a little bit of our wood grain, and I found a result that I like. And again, we want this to be very subtle, so we want to make sure that we set a very low intensity when we combine together with our base normal map. So continuing down the chain, I want to take a look at creating some of the larger wood grain or the wood warping geometry that we are going to see on a thinly cut plank of wood. And so the way that I want to start creating that is I'm going to add a gradient to linear. And what we're going to do with this guy is we're going to just bump up the tiling to 16. Now we're going to come back and change that later most likely, but for now we're just going to bump it up to 16. I'm going to add a warp node, and I'm going to take another Gaussian noise. Now with the warp intensity, I'm going to bump this up to something like 100. And you can see that's a little bit too intense because that's very, very fine detail. So now we can start to scale away and see what we would be more interested in getting. And I want to decrease the Gaussian scale just a little bit. And now bump up the warp intensity again, and we'll try something like 7. And let's do not 99. Let's go down to 9. And this is just going to give us some nice kind of wood grooves and some nice warping. The next thing that I want to do is I want to take our warp here, and I'm going to add this guy through another directional warp. This time when in the intensity input, I'm going to take a directional noise 2 just to break up things a little bit more. And I'm going to plug that guy in. And you can see now we're starting to give the warping a little bit of wood grain to it. And you can see that we've actually created a nice looking wood pattern that we can overlay on top of our boards here. Now if I was to overlay this on top of our wood pattern here, we're going to get a pretty uniform looking design. And so I'm going to do that right now. I'm going to take a normal map, like we did with our wood grain over here, plug this guy in, greatly decrease the intensity. We'll do something like 0.5 for now. I'm going to create another normal combine, making sure that this normal combine is our base layer for this normal, and taking this guy as our foreground or top layer. And then I'm going to plug this guy into our normal. And you can see when I do that, we start to get a nice wood pattern, but the wood pattern is pretty uniform across all of our planks. And it kind of looks like we've just taken an image and just kind of slapped it over top. So what I want to do is I want to randomize these patterns so that it doesn't look like we have just one texture just blop right over top of our entire material. So there's one little step in between when we add it to a normal map and right after we directionally warp our wood. So I'm going to create another directional warp node, but this time instead of adding a random noise to our intensity input, I'm going to add the actual planks themselves as the intensity input. So I'm going to come back here to where we have our slope, and we're going to use this as our intensity input. I'm going to take this guy and I'm going to plug him right in. And you can see now when I do that, we actually start to use our map here to influence where the actual displacement or the warp of our material or our texture takes place. And so now when I increase the intensity to 100 and I zoom in, you're able to see where the boards actually occur. And they don't overlap onto the next board, making it look a little bit more unique. And we can also play around with our warp angle, again, to just play around with how our material or our texture is tiling. And so I'm going to keep it down at 0 for now, because I don't really see too many areas that are overlapping or look too uniform. So I'm going to come back, and I'm going to make sure that we turn our normal intensity way down to something like 0.1. And so now we're getting some pretty awesome looking boards where we have both the wood grain and the knot or warping of our planes. So now that we've got both of our wood grain and our wood warping complete, now I want to go and start creating the actual knots that we're going to get in various areas of our wood planks. So I want to start off by creating a shape node. And so for this, we're just going to use a very basic shape to start off with. And we're going to come down to our pattern and we're going to use paraboloid. And this is just going to be the basic shape that we're going to use for creating kind of the perimeter of our knot that we're going to overlay on top. So the first thing I want to do is I want to warp this guy, and I'm going to use once again another Gaussian noise, and this time we're going to really crank down the scale, so we're going to get some very soft looking gradients. So I'm going to bring this into our warp. And right now you can see that it really doesn't do too much. So if I bump this up to 5, now we're starting to get some more effects. And if I take our shape node and I decrease the scale, you're going to notice it quite a bit more. And so I'm going to come back to our warp and I'm going to try 10. And I like the look of that. And we can also play around with our scale. But I think I'm going to leave it at 5 because 5 looks pretty good. That looks organic enough, doesn't it? So now we need to actually make it start to look like a wood knot does with the rings. And so like we did for our actual wood warping, I'm going to take another gradient 2 node. And I'm going to create a gradient dynamic node. And so I'm going to take our gradient dynamic and I'm going to plug this guy just in the gradient input in the bottom there. And I'm going to take this guy and put him up over top. Now we're not going to notice anything right away. And that's because I want to come down and I want to switch the number of gradients we have. So I'm going to bump that all the way up to 16. And you can see that on the way, we're switching between black and white. And all I need to do is I just need to change the rotation of our gradient linear to 90 degrees. And now you can see what this node is doing. So we're just going to basically overlay based on the gradient that we've inputted here. We're going to take this pattern and overlay it on top. And so if I tile it, you can see that along the gradient we're tiling this gradient linear 2. And so I like tiling it to around 8. And what I'm going to do next is just add a blur high quality grayscale. Just so that we can blur this a little bit because you can see it's pretty sharp and it's pretty noisy. So I'm going to bring this down, making sure to double click on it. I'm going to have it probably around point. Maybe we'll try 0.1. That's a little too low. Let's try 0.25. And so just like that, we're able to get away from a little bit or eliminate some of the noise that we're getting there. So we get a little bit of a cleaner geometry that we're going to be able to warp. So the last thing that I want to do is I just want to add an invert grayscale. And we're going to just use the invert of this to plug into our tile generator. So I'm going to move this guy over. And now we want to tile this. And we're going to use the tile generator to just throw our warp node around and just randomize it essentially. So I'm going to come down to where we have pattern. And I want to make sure that I check on image input. And so we're going to get all of these knots, and they're going to just pattern them on both the X and the Y. And you can see that we get an X and a Y amount up top over here. And I'm going to decrease these down to around, we'll do 7 by 7. I want to also play around with the scale random just a little bit to randomize everything up. I want to make sure that I play around with our offset so that we get them just kind of thrown all over the place. We can also change the X and the Y here, as well as the global offset, which just moves everything uniformly. Down here, we're able to play around with the rotation. Again, this is going to rotate everything uniformly. And we can also rotate things randomly. And this is what we're going to want to do because we want to have things just a little bit randomized so that they don't look like they're just a cookie cutter version of each other. Lastly, what I want to do is I want to come down and just randomly mask off a lot of these so that they're not just thrown all around our material. We want to kind of have them sparingly. So I'm going to do around 0.85 on our mask. And so now we've only got just a few nodes or a few warps that we're going to throw around. I just want to come up back to the scale as well, and I just want to bring these down because knots generally tend to be a little bit smaller. And again, this might be too small, but we're going to put it over top of our geometry and we're going to take a look. The next thing that I want to do is I want to add another warp node on top of this guy because I want to once again randomly vary how these are actually interpreted. And so I'm just going to take our Gaussian over here and I'm going to plug that guy in just so that we can save a little bit of a resource and that we don't have to load in another auxiliary noise node. So I'm going to come in and make sure that as I'm increasing the intensity, I don't bump anything up too far. And I think those look pretty good. The last thing that I want to do is pretty much the same thing that we did for the wood warping over here, where we actually directionally warped it with the planes or the planks. So I'm going to do the exact same thing where I'm going to add a directional warp. And I'm just going to control and left click on this guy here. And I'm going to plug him into our directional warp. So now you can see if we bump this up, as I rotate the warp angle, you can see that it's actually using the planks as kind of a mask, so it won't find its way within any of the crevices between the boards, and it's going to randomize a little bit going across. The further up you increase this, again, the more random it's going to be. And I'm going to stick with something like that for now. So just like we've been doing, I now want to add a normal map on top of this. And we're going to run this black and white through our normal map. And you can see that we're going to get some noisy look and detail. Along our chain here, I'm going to add another normal combine. And I'm going to take this guy and I'm going to plug it in over top. We also want to make sure that we make sure this is detail oriented. And now you can see that we're combining the intensity or the knots themselves over top of the initial grain. But now this looks kind of weird for two different reasons that I can see. One, it kind of looks like it's sticking out of the board here, and that's because we have our white values indicated as basically elevating away from the surface. So I just want to add an invert grayscale onto this guy so that we're actually subtracting from our mesh or our material when we add these guys over top. And another thing that I noticed is that normally with our knots, as the wood grain is going towards it, it tends to warp around the knot, and it's not doing that in this case here. So what I'm going to do is move down here, and I'm going to add a blur high quality grayscale. And so what I want to do with this guy is I want to take where we've added the directional warp on our knots, and I'm going to bring this one down into our blur. And all this is going to do is just create some soft gradiated blurs where we've got our knots. And essentially what I'm going to do is take our warp, this guy over here, and I'm going to take our blurs of our knots, and I'm going to subtract the value. And I'm going to use that to also warp, so that we get some warping around the knots in those specific areas. And that might be a little bit hard to conceptualize now, but stay with me because we're going to walk through it relatively slow. So we've got our blurs down here. I'm going to add a warp node, and I'm going to use these blurs as the intensity. And so right now we're going to get a blank texture because there's no actual input for our warp. So what I want to do is come back here to where we've got our wood warping. I'm going to take the output of this guy and plug that right into our warp. So now if I double click, you can see that we get a little bit of warping down in these areas. And immediately that's going to add to the illusion that we've got these knots running through our material. Again, that's going to look really nice once we add our knots over top. So the next thing I want to do is take the warp, and I'm going to add a blend node over top, making sure that this guy is in the background. I want to take our blur here, and I'm going to add a levels node over top. And so now what we're going to use the blur is to subtract the values of our blur here from the areas where we've got the warping. And this is going to help us really enunciate the geometry or the normal map of the knots. So when I plug this guy in over top, nothing's going to change immediately, and that's because I want to go down to subtract blending mode. And you can only notice a slight difference. But what this is going to do is allow us to basically remove any information of the normal map of our warped wood grains here. And you'll see what I mean in a second. So I'm going to take our levels, I'm going to bring it down. You can see in our material that's causing this area, on all the areas where the warp is, to go black. And in our normal map, a flat color is going to be smooth in whichever direction the color indicates, black being a lower recessed area and white being higher elevated areas. I also want to bring down the white level just a little bit. And so now we can see what that's going to look like. So now that we've got that out of the way, I'm going to add another blend on top. And this blend is going to be where we actually add the warps that we've created over top of the warped geometry that we've now used to substitute and help add to the illusion. So I'm going to take our direction of warps up here, and I'm going to plug this guy in over top. And then coming down here, I want to make sure that we go down to screen. And what screen is going to do is it's just going to get rid of all the black areas in the top mask or the top texture. And it's just going to put all the lighter values on over top. I'm also just going to decrease the opacity a little bit just so that it's not too stark. I also noticed that the darker value reaches a little bit too far outside of where our actual warp is. So I'm going to increase our black value just a little bit and bring our white value back a little bit more too, so that it's not too far outside. And so now that we've got this guy, we can actually remove this normal combine, and we can take away this normal map right here, because we no longer want to have two of the same normal map over top of each other. So now with this normal map, we can add our normal. We can get rid of this normal map here, and we're going to be able to plug this guy in over top. And now you can see that we're getting a very harsh intensity once again. And so we want to bring this down to something like 0.1. And I notice in my normal map here, I'm getting some flat areas. And so I'm going to come back into our levels. Make sure to dial back just a little bit of the white value so that it's not subtracting all of our information. And so now we're going to get some nice warping around our knots. And the nice thing is, the way we've structured our workflow here, whenever we want to change our location of our knots here, it's going to work seamlessly because we've added this to the chain. So now all of the blurs that help sell the illusion and help warp the wood grain around our knots is going to follow wherever we decide. And in this way, we've just essentially created a smarter material that's going to be really useful for us if we want to change things outside of Substance Designer. So we've actually gone ahead and completed all of the geometry portions that I wanted to do for this material. And so now I'm going to go ahead and actually get rid of the base material that we've been using to view our material. And I'm going to start plugging things into the outputs. So I'm going to delete this guy. And now we can take this guy and plug it into our normal output and come all the way back here and take this guy and plug him into our height. And so now we can right click anywhere in our graph and hit view outputs in 3D. And now we're going to show all of the results of our outputs on our mesh here. And so because we have nothing going into our albedo, roughness, and our metallic, we're going to get essentially null values for those slots. And so what I'm going to do is I'm going to come down here and add a uniform color for our roughness. I'm just going to make sure it's set to grayscale for now, and I'm going to bring that up to about halfway, just so that we get a little bit of an easier view of our material here. I also want to come down and I want to add another output node. And what I'm going to use this one for is our ambient occlusion. So I'm going to make sure to add item with the little plus here. Come down to ambient occlusion. And I'm going to make sure that I just label these appropriately. And so now we're able to use this guy for our ambient occlusion output. And all I have to do is take our height value here and use that as the input. But there's a couple things I want to do before we get to that. So the first thing I want to do is I want to add a histogram range to our height. And so I'm going to left click and control on this guy here and plug him in. And this is going to give us much more control over our height of our material here. And you can see if we look up top, we have two parameters that we're able to play with. One is the range, which is the value, the range in values that we're going to be able to get sliding the slider up or down. And you can see here that we're decreasing the contrast or increasing the contrast. And the bottom one is our position. And what this is going to do is give us a uniform way to increase the value of our entire material or decrease the value of our material in terms of our height map. So I like to bump this guy up to around 0.6 and also increase the contrast. So now that we have this control, we're able to plug in our histogram range directly into our ambient occlusion. And now over top of this guy, I just want to add an ambient occlusion node itself. And this is going to further give us control over top of what we're viewing on our material here. And so you can see, as I come down, we have a bunch of different parameters. But first, in order to view this node, we need to right-click in our material. And we need to view outputs in 3D. And so we're not going to be able to really see too much of this node because we have such a dark color of our material. I'm going to take this uniform color guy and I'm just going to plug it in so that we have a softer and brighter toned material. So as we come back down, you can see that we have a bunch of different parameters which are going to increase our shadows and the radius of those shadows. And we also have a GPU optimization. So I just want to click that to drastically reduce the call time for this node, just to make things a little bit more efficient. So I want to come back up to our height depth here, because you can see this is all of our shadow information. And I can play around with how deep these shadows really go, based on the height map that we're feeding into our ambient occlusion. And so something like that looks pretty good. So now that we've completed both our height and our ambient occlusion down here, I want to go ahead and take a look at our metallic real quick. And so because this isn't a metallic material, we don't need to worry too much about what we're doing because it's just going to be a black texture. However, because we want to be conscientious of file sizes, and depending on which software we want to display this later, we do have to kind of keep in mind certain things. I often find myself using the Unity engine quite frequently, and with the Unity engine, they keep the smoothness map within the alpha of our metallic. And so I just want to make sure that we are smart when making our material to maximize the result that we're getting. And so I want to add just a color, plug that in, and I want to make sure that this is set to grayscale. The next thing I want to do is I want to make sure that we're not wasting resources on a completely black texture and having to load a 2K texture of just black every single time. So in order to change the output size, I'm just going to come up here and set this guy to absolute. And I'm going to bump this down to 16 pixels by 16 pixels. And so now every time this material loads in a game engine, it's going to load a 16 by 16 pixel black image for its metallic map. However, like I mentioned in Unity, because it uses its metallic map as kind of a folder or a container for the smoothness map, it's going to give me a 16 by 16 pixel smoothness map for this material. And so in order to kind of circumvent that, all we need to do is add a levels node on top. And we need to make sure that we set this size to relative to parent. And you can see that we're getting a 2K map. So it will be however big we actually set the parent size of the entire material to, which is in this case a 2K texture. Next, I'm going to take a look at our roughness map, which is used to define the surface irregularities of our material. So I'm going to bring this guy back up here, and I'm just going to delete the connection because we still want to have a relatively gray material, just to help us view what's going on. So a good indicator of surface detail and surface irregularities is actually held within our normal map here. As you can see, it holds a lot of edge information, which are good indicators of where light is bouncing off of and reflecting from. So the first thing that I do normally when creating a roughness map is I get a curvature smooth node, and I just pull from our normal map, and I use this guy as a basis. And you can see that we're getting already a lot of edge information and small details that we actually had put in our normal map. So I take this guy and I plug him right into our roughness. And immediately the problem I see with that is that white in a roughness map indicates rougher surfaces, while black indicates much smoother areas. And now this wouldn't make a lot of sense in this material because the blacker values for the most part are actually the crevices or the spaces in between the boards. And so what I want to do is I want to take our curvature here. I'm going to add a levels node on top. And then I'm going to just invert our levels here to better reflect our material. The rougher areas being inside the cracks of the boards, and the boards themselves being a little bit smoother and a little bit more reflective. And you can see as we bump this up, we get much sharper reflections. And if we increase this up, we get a much more diffuse and matte material. I also just want to increase the black and white outputs just so that they're not pure values. And so now we're getting a nice looking material. However, with the roughness that we have going on right now, it looks a little bit too uniform. And with the roughness map, you're able to tell a little bit more of a story in terms of the aging and the character of a certain material. And so I want to add a little bit more variety and a little bit more dust and grunge, because after all, this is a floor material. So in order to do that, I'm just going to pull up a B&W spots. And this is just going to give me a bunch of different dust specks and a little bit of grunge and noise. So I'm going to take this guy and I'm going to add a blend over top of our levels here. I'm going to just plug him in. And immediately you're going to see that we're just getting the B&W spots over top of our material. And you can see the effect that it's going to have. If I want to show our levels node underneath, I just want to come over to our blending mode and I'll go down to something like multiply. And you can see what that's given us right now. We can also play around with the opacity to change this around. And if we don't like that, we can again play around with the blending modes just to get a bunch of different results. And so I like something like that, where we get a little bit more of a matte material with some areas that are a little bit grungier than others. And so we've actually already taken care of our normal map just based off of the geometry portion alone. So I'm going to leave the normal map as it is. I think it does a pretty good job of giving us some nice looking detail. The last thing that I want to do is I want to take a look at our base color. And the first thing that I want to do about adding to that is I'm going to take our wood fibers and I'm going to use that as kind of a basis for what our color is going to look like. So I'm going to add a gradient map and I'm going to go to where our wood grain is. I'm going to find this guy down here and I'm going to plug him in to our gradient map, and it's going to give us the exact same result. So we use the gradient map node for two different things. First of all, we take our grayscale image and we're actually able to convert it to a color image. And this is going to allow us to display color on our base color output. We also use it because we get this gradient editor, which is very robust in its ability to pick and slide different color values along a gradient. And you can see here, because we have a black and white image, we get the perfect kind of gradient in between our values, both black and white. In our editor, we get this nice little gradient line or spectrum, and if you just click on it, you get both of these handles that you can play around with. You can also add handles by clicking anywhere, and you can delete them by dragging them up. We also get a nice little color key in here, and if we click on a handle, we are able to maneuver around and play around with all the colors, and we can change them on the fly. So what I want to do initially with our gradient map is I want to just play around with some color values until I get something that I like. And for now, I just want to do very, very subtle differences in value. And so now I've just added a bunch of different handles on our line here, our grayscale. And it's just going to give us a bunch of different color values, which we're going to use as kind of the foundation for our base color. So now what I'm going to do is delete this uniform color, and I'm going to plug this guy right into our base color. And immediately we're already getting some pretty nice looking results actually. But we still want to add some more color detail. So I'm going to add a blend on top of this guy. I'm going to bring him back. And I'm going to add another gradient map over top. And so now I'm going to blend these two colors together. And the next color that I'm going to use is the actual wood warping geometry that we had made to add a little bit more variety to color in our map. So I'm going to come back to our wood warping here. Click on this guy and I'm going to plug him right in to our gradient map. And again, we're just using this to convert our grayscale image into a color image, and we also get some detail, some tools to help us with the finer details. And again, I just want to do some very subtle browns. And now I'm going to plug this guy in over top of our blend. And so now we're going to get this showing up instead of our bottom texture here. And so what I want to do is I just want to take our blending mode, and I'm just going to scroll through until I find something that I like. And so I think I like this add linear dodge. And what I'm going to do is I'm just going to bring the opacity back down so that we can get a little bit of a blend between our two images here. And so I think that is really giving us a nice looking effect. The next thing that I want to do is I want to add our knots back into our color texture here. Because if we look at hardwood or any sort of wood that's been split, you can see that the knots are actually a little bit darker in color value. So I'm going to do the same thing by adding a blend. And I'm going to go and find our knots. And I'm going to use this one right here where we've added a directional warp onto our knots. I'm going to add another gradient map. I'm just going to plug that guy in. And so now I'm going to use this over top. And we're going to see exactly where our knots are showing up. And so now what I want to do is I actually want to invert this texture here, or this color map. so that we get our knots as the darker values. Because what I plan to do for this map is I actually want to switch the blending mode over to multiply to get rid of all the lighter information. And I'm going to only keep the darker information. And we can see that it's giving us this very dark knots. And so what I want to do is I just want to make it more of a darker brown. And just play around with the values a little bit as well. You can also play around with the opacity, just so that it's a very subtle effect. Now the last thing that I want to do for our color is I want to take our edge information, our normal detail, and I want to go ahead and kind of add more edge wear and scratches to just make the material seem even that more authentic. And so how I'm going to go about doing that is I'm going to go find my normal output here where we've got all of this edge information, and I'm going to use that as the basis for creating somewhat of a mask where I'm going to find all of this edge wear. And so what I'm going to do to pull that edge information out of my normal map is I'm going to add a curvature Sobel. I'm going to bring this guy and plug him right in. And so now you can see we can change the intensity of the edge information that we're getting from our normal map here. And I'm going to crank that all the way up so that we get very highly contrasted values. So now when I bring this guy back up, I'm going to add another gradient map along. As well, I'm going to make sure to add another blend. And now I'm going to play around with my gradient map. So I plug this guy in. And I really want to get rid of kind of the edge information in here. And I just want to keep it along the edges of the planks. And so I'm going to bring up our black values quite a bit. Bring the whites over just a little bit, but really get rid of the values there. And something like that. And so now you can see that this is going to be used as a mask to basically find all of the highlighted edges, and we're going to just basically make those look like scratches out of our hardwood. However, it looks a little too uniform for me right now. So what I want to do is I want to do a little bit more edge damage. And so on top of our gradient map, I'm just going to add a slope blur. And with the slope of that node, I'm going to add a fractal sum base. And so when I plug this guy in, we're going to get very fine information because it's very noisy. And so if I click back on our slope and I increase the samples and heavily decrease the intensity, now we're going to get something that starts to resemble a little bit more of our edge wear. I'm also going to come back up to our fractal. I'm just going to play around with some of its parameters. And even by just playing around with the roughness, you can see that we get a little bit more non-uniform edge destruction as opposed to just straight. And so I'm going to use something around there just to give it a little bit of a non-uniform look. And now with our gradient again, I'm just going to take our white value and I want to make this a lighter brown. Something like that. And when we go back to our blend, like we've done before, to get rid of the black values, I'm just going to hit screen. And now you can see that we get a lot of edge wear. And we can control this by simply just moving our sliders around.